Okay, can everybody hear?
I hear you, Rabbi.
Okay, great. I think tonight's share is being sponsored. I see Mrs. Oppenheim there, in memory of Magnus Oppenheim, who was really very special attendee of our share. Really, somebody who not only came every week and participated, but really was part of the Ruach HaChaim of the group. Who really loved to learn so much, and he had such a great passion and enthusiasm for it that we miss him very much, and it's very appropriate that the shiur should be dedicated in his memory.
Thank you.
Okay, the topic for this evening is Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. So again, we've been jumping around a lot in the first chapter. We sometimes do things a little bit out of order. But the important thing is the topics, not so much the order. So again, getting back to the Gemara and Beis on Beis and Gimel and Aleph, even though we've also done Dalet and Hey. So the again, the background, as we've discussed, is that the Gemara says that a shliach who brings a get, who brings the divorce from Medina Sayam to Eretz Yisrael, has to say b'fanei nachtam, b'fanei nachtam. He has to say that this bill of divorce was prepared in my presence. It was written, it was signed in my presence. And the Gemara wants to know why it's enough to have a single individual make that claim. After all, typically testimony requires two people. It's not sufficient to have one. So the Gemara is on Beis on the Beis, the same Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph says, here, let me just write. L'Rabba da'amar lefi shein b'kiyan l'shma libai trei. Don't you need two witnesses? Mid'dahava kol arayos. I'm sorry, kol eduyos shebetorah. After all, any this is, by the way, on our Numar Makomos, if you have them. This is on page 1, the first entry. So you always need two witnesses. One witness is never enough to establish, something with regard to personal status, like marriage or divorce, or for that matter, like a monetary transaction. Also requires two witnesses. So it's very peculiar that one witness would suffice. So the Gemara says, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim.
Right.
The Gemara says that one witness is always believed when it comes to matters of Isur v'Heter. In other words, they're not believed for personal marital status, and they're not believed for a monetary transaction, but a single witness would always be believed to establish the ritual status of something. For example, in kashrus, like you have a piece of meat, you don't know whether it came from the kosher butcher shop or the non-kosher butcher shop. So Eid Echad is Ne'eman, B'Yisurim. That's just one example of many. So the Gemara thought that was applicable here. And then the Gemara says, maybe the only time that we say this principle, that an Eid Echad is believed in matters of Isur v'Heter, is kagon chaticha safek chelev, safek shuman, delo is chazik Isur. That's if you have, you're trying to identify an object to see whether or not it is permissible to eat it or not. It has no previous history that we're aware of. We come to this object with a question mark. You find a piece of meat and you don't know where it came from. Could be kosher, could be not kosher. So it has no personal history one way or another. So we say Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. But Aval Hachad is Chazik Yisur Deishasish. Have a davar shebe'erva, vein davar shebe'erva, pakos mishnayim. Now, whether the Gemara is making one comment or two comments is really a matter of debate. But there are two factors that are being identified here. One is that whenever there is a status quo ante, which means there's a previous status or identity, you can't override that with Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. That's what the Gemara seems to be saying. In other words, if we had previous knowledge that the object in question was not kosher, then the Eid Echad would not be Ne'eman to say now it's kosher. Okay? We'll get back to that in just a minute. Moreover, in matters of personal issues, stature and status, like divorce, marriage, etc., when it comes to issues like that, we always require two witnesses. The ein davar shebe'erva pachas mishnai. So the Gemara's conclusion finally is, yes, rov b'kiyan hein, v'afilu Rab Meir dechai shlom yuta stam sifrei d'daini migmer kmiri, rabbanan hu da'atzrach. Meaning, if this were really a question, we were objectively really concerned that this get wasn't prepared properly and it wasn't lishma, then we would have required two witnesses to establish its credentials. However, to begin with, it's not much of a doubt, because who prepares a get? A sofer, meaning a formal scribe, because that's prepared exactly the right way. So typically, the person who is trained to artistically, to be a scribe, is also trained to know the laws of these documents. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. So typically, a scribe, knows not only how to write a document, but also the minimum halachic requirements for the document, which includes lishma. And therefore, the whole concern that maybe it's lo lishma is kind of a far, distant, possibility. And since it's a distant possibility, and mishum aguna kila rabbanan, we want the woman to be able to continue with her life. So the Chachamim said that it's good enough to have one person in this case to make this call. Okay, so the same Gemara appears on Gimel Amud Aleph. In Masechet Yevamos, a similar Gemara appears with regard to the problem of Eid Echad b'Misa.
So just to be clear, we prefer two, but we're allowing one, right? We prefer two. Or we don't need two. That's what I'm trying to understand, because the way you just said it.
For this, we don't need two for this. We would have if it was a more serious concern. If we're really worried about the problem.
So this is like eating in someone's home. Just like you can eat in someone's home and trust them. This is equal of magnitude.
Well, I wouldn't compare it to eating in someone's home. Depends who the someone is.
What I'm saying, we say Eid Echad Nemavisur, and you can eat in someone's home, right? If they're trustworthy. And we're saying now that also Eid Echad works, because
in the conclusion, we're not necessarily concluding that it's Midin Eid Echad Nemavisur. It could be it's some special law about B'fanei Nechtam, B'fanei Nechtam. So we'll probably get back to that point a little bit later on. But for now, this is one of the most important discussions of Eid Echad Nemavisur that we find in the Talmud. Here, Masechet Yevamos, which we'll get to in a minute. There are a couple of Gemaras in Kiddushin, Daf Tamechei. So this is an important Gemara, centering on that theme. Anyways, so here's where the Rishonim try to figure out what is the source for Eid Echad Nemavisur. After all, it's one thing to say that it works, but how do they know it?
Is this the Makor and Shas? Like, this is the main sugya of Eid Echad Nemavisur, or is there another?
This and Yevamos are probably
okay.
These are the main ones. And also, the
Yevamos is about Iguna, right?
Is also utilized in other Gemaras, but in terms of discussing it, this is one of the most important. This is among the two or three most important. So Rashi here in Gittin, if you look on the Marmakomos or in the Gemara, either way, says Umishani Eid Echad Nemavisur. And Rashi adds Shaharei Mina Torah Kol Echad V'Echad MiYisrael. After all, we typically trust members of Klal Yisrael, right? Jacob said before, as long as they don't have a bad track record, they're not chashudim. Shaharei Mina Torah Kol Echad V'Echad MiYisrael Ala Frashas Truma, Ala Shchita, Al Nikra Hagid V'Hachet. So this is fascinating because it's not a source, it's an indication. Meaning Rashi's saying, listen, the practice in Klal Yisrael is to rely on the statement of an Eid Echad. So no, we've never found that if you're going to be mafresh in Eretz Yisrael, you have Tvua in Eretz Yisrael, produce in Eretz Yisrael is automatically what we call tevel, right? So you have to be mafresh trumos and maestros. So we never heard, says Rashi, that to believe you that you took Trumas Umaisros and to be able to eat your produce, that you would have to bring 2 witnesses to show that. We believe you because you said you did. So
are these EG examples or IE examples? Because they seem, if they were just IE, then why these 3? If they're EG.
So it's even worse than that. That's a great point. It's even worse than that because, as we'll see in a moment, Tosas is going to accuse Rashi of providing inaccurate examples. So they're good examples of Isurim, but as Tosas is going to point out in just a minute, they're Isurim where it seems like there's what we call a Chazak Isura, which the Gemara seemed to reject. This Chazak Isura means they had a previous status quo which needs to be overridden or neutralized. So, for example, if Tvua grows in Eretz Yisrael, it's automatically Tevel until you fix it. And if an animal, needs shechita, you can't eat an animal until it's properly shechted, right? But until you do that, it's either treifa or nevela or aver menachai. So in all these cases, there's kaskas iser. Even something like what we call nikar hagid or nikar hachelev with a kuf, nikar, is literally means you have to excise, you have to do a surgical maneuver. You have to get the fat, which is prohibited, out of the meat. So you have to know how to cut it out. Or the giranasha. What do we say giranasha is again? Is it a nerve? I remember we discussed it way back.
The sciatic nerve is what they say.
Oh, it is a sciatic nerve. Oh, wow.
No, but whatever. It's translated in English as some muscle loin, which I never understood. But
yeah, okay. You're our expert on the and you're an expert in the anatomy in general, but especially halachic anatomy. I know it's a bit of a hobby, right? So anyway, so the gid anasha is prohibited. You're not allowed to eat it. So you have to cut it out of the, of the animal. But all these things, until you do that, the default, previous status is that it's prohibited. So, and nonetheless, Rashi says this is the source. So if you look at, in the next line of the Gemara says, you can't apply Dechonem Bisurim to Gittin because it's a Cheskasei Shasish. Because default, she's prohibited, she's married. She's married until she's not married. So that's called the Chazak Isura. So if you look at that, Rashi knew that too. So Rashi says, look at Hacha is Chazak, Rashi says, Bahak Isasa, Isra Eshasish. And then he says, but isn't Tevel and all the and shchita, the examples that I gave before, they're also as Chazak Isura. So it's fascinating. Rashi says, Bahachis Isra Eshasish, Umitevel shchita lo gamrinan kirabrinim biyavamos, the Hassam biyoda letaknan, lefikach neman lahoyed aleim. So he quotes the Gemara in Yevamos, which says that when it comes to shchita, when it comes to hafrashas trumos, the reason that we believe him is because even though it's a skazak isura, they're trying to override a default isur, but it's biyado letakein. He has the ability. It's in his hands, meaning he's in control. He could do the shchita. He could, or he could hire a shochet. He could, surgically remove the giranasha and the chaleb. He could be mafresh trumas umaisros and thereby fix this tevel. So that's what Tosas Rashi is saying. It's not like Eshasish. Eshasish you need to get. It's not biyado. So, but when it comes to truma, when it comes to shchita, when it comes to nikar agid, the hachelev, it's biyado. Nonetheless, Tosas says, look at Tosas. The Ramaskal Eidachad Neman B'Yisurin, either on the page or in the Marmakomos. So he calls out Rashi on this point. He says, Pirs B'Kuntras, Shari Yamina Torah Kalachad V'Yachad Al Afrashas Trumo Shchita V'Nikra Agid V'Chelev. So that's period. That's Rashi. That's a quote of Rashi. Now Tosas is talking. Tosas says, V'Lo Hayalo Lahazkir Afrashas Trumo Shchita. Tosas says it's a mistake that Rashi gives as an example in Echad Neman B'Surim, Shchita, and Hafrashas Truma. Why? The Bahanu Neman Afagav this Chazak Isura. These are cases that are Chazak Isura, and from that point of view would have been not believed. The only reason we believe is Mishum Biyado Lataknam. Kamosha Pirusha Kuntis B'Samak. Rashi himself mentions this. It's based on the Gemara in Yevamos. V'hachi Amar Ba'isha Rabba. So basically what Tosas is saying is, how can you bring a source for Eidachon Bisurim in a case where it doesn't work? It doesn't work here because of Eidachon Bisurim. It works here because of Biyado L'Takein. And then he adds, Ushchita afagav dahashta ein Biyado L'Takein, mikara haya Biyado L'Shchot. Even if right now he can't do the Shchita, he could have in the past, and that's good enough. I'll explain in a minute. Dimlokein amay mehemen. Given this Chazak Yisur, the Lo Matzinu b'Shemokom she'Yitzarich beGadol Echadom al Gavov u'Maisim b'Chayom the Mehemen afagav Lo Shaykh Rov Mitzuyin Eitz Shchita Mumchenheim Kagon Shenechtach Kol Harosh Ve'im Beis HaShchita Nikar. So he's basically saying this is not based on Eidachon Bisurim. It's based on the principle of Biyado, on the principle that he could change the status if he wants. The reason that we rely on people when they say something was slaughtered properly and it's kosher. So Tosas basically is criticizing Rashi, saying, how could Rashi say that the source of Eidachon Neman Bisurim is the reality? It's not a source in the norm. Typically, I say, what's the makar, what's the source? You have to quote me a pasuk, right? Rashi isn't quoting a pasuk. Rashi's saying, listen, ma'asim b'chol b'chol yom, people all the time rely on other people. So does that mean that they're right? Right? But that isn't what bothers Tosas. That's what bothers me. I'll get back to that in a minute. But what bothers Tosas is, forget about that. It's also just not the right case, because the reason that you're neman on shchita or you're neman on trumo, that you're neman on chelev, not because of Eidachon Bisurim. If that were the case, if it were only that, we'd say it's a chazak isura. You're trying to override its previous status, and that doesn't work. It's only because of biyado. Biyado is a separate factor, according to Tosas. Oh, so what is the source for Eidachon Bisurim? That's a great question. So Tosas goes on to say, once he shot down Rashi's explanation, doesn't he have to provide his own? Right? So what is the source? So Tosas says, Oliver Shas, Yeshlomar di Alfina Minida. The source for Eidachon Neman Bisurim is the fact that we always believe the woman, when she speaks about her ritual purity, we always believe her. The Alfina Minida Dvarshim Beperikamadir, the Safra law, Li'atzma. She is the one who's in charge of her, status, in terms of ritual purity. And the Safra law, she counts herself. And we rely on that, even though there are matters of Isser and Heter, as long as she is in a state of Nida and didn't go to be Tovel in the mikvah, she's prohibited from interacting with her husband.
And from that we learn out everything. Why don't we follow the same format that we say by a woman that she would not? The reason we believe 1A is because she doesn't want to get herself into deep trouble. This is the same situation. If she would be lying about these kind of matters, you're dealing with very serious consequences.
Well, the Gemara never says. The Gemara does say that about Eidachon b'misa sabal. That
So if we're going to use this, it could be that this is Eidachon is okay here because of the same severity.
Right, but the Gemara never ever said that. And the Gemara never says that the woman's belief credibility in Nida has something to do with it blowing up in her face.
But the Gemara never says what the reason is, and we're trying to learn out, so to speak, from this all a general all, but Eidach Hanam B'Yisurin.
Right. So
And this
Tosfos
is-
assumes.
and this is a much more severe case that has reasons why we would think that a woman would be careful about not telling the truth in something like this, because the consequences.
No, I hear the question. But Tosfos is just assuming that this is the, that there aren't these other additional factors. It's just Eidach Hanam B'Yisurim, as long as there's no Ischazak Yisura. Why is there no Ischazak Yisura? That's the question. Because after all, if she is Roa Nida, if she has
She has a chazaka of being in a bad state right now, so she
in a
should.
state until she's Tovelis. So
And-
this also says something fascinating.
And the Gemara brought up later on that there's a difference between whether your chazaka position is, in other words, we
That's what
usually
we've been discussing. Yeah.
use Eidach, but only if it's a balanced.
Right. That's his objection against Rashi. So now he has to. So that's why he says something really very extraordinary, which I'll explain later. But first, let me get it on the record. If you're believing her when she says she's a nida based on Vasafra law, then aren't you saying that? And that's a source for Eidacha Naman B'Yisurim. How could you say it doesn't apply to override Ischazak Yisura? She is in a state of Isur until she's Tavelas, right? That's the question. Shlomar de'ena b'cheska sheteheroa kol shah. Ukeshavru shiva tehora mimela, those Chazak Yisura, right? V'gam biyada litbal. So Tosfos says a bunch of things here.
Is this Pesha hit the Pesha is? I mean, is this?
Not really. The impim pasha also Pesha hitzer. But Tosfos is saying is this is omedes lehishtanos, number one. I mean, she's roa nida, but it comes and goes. The state of nida.
Does it make a difference if she has a standard monthly
No.
time?
It doesn't seem like it, but that's a great question. Whether she has a veset or not. But what Tosfos is saying is this isn't this chazak yisur because it comes and goes. It's like a chazaka homedes lehishtanos. Okay, but we'll get back to that. What's the answer for Rashi before we get there? What's the answer for Rashi? Rashi says that Eidach Hanam B'Yisurim is based on the example of tevel and shchita and removing chelev and removing giranasha. Tosfos has a very good claim against Rashi. Namely, how could that be the source of Eidach Hanam B'Yisurim? It's a case of Ischazak Yisura. And even though we believe the person in that case, we only believe him because of Biyado. So the Chidushe Haran and the Marik, and after them, I guess other people too, make the following suggestion for Rashi. They say the following. Tosfos thinks that the idea of Biyado, the fact that the person has the ability, to bring about this change, they think that's an independent source for credibility for Namans. Indeed, the Rosh in Perek HaNizakin, later on in Gittin, says, don't think that Biyado is a kind of a migu. In other words, since I could change it, you believe me to say what it is. That's not the pshat, says the Rosh. Biyado is a kind of bailus. What does he mean by that? He doesn't explain, but I'll explain. The Gemara in the end of Masachet Kedusha, we've talked about this in the past, says that people who have like special knowledge, meaning they are in a position to know better than others, are given extra credibility. So, for example, the Gemara says, "Nemenes hachaya lomar ze yatsa rishon ze yatsa achra." The midwife is believed to say this is the first child and this is the second, or this child belongs to this mother and that child belongs to this other person. How can we believe the midwife? Because she is uniquely in a position to know. The same Gemara says, Ne'eman Adayan, a judge who renders a halachic decision, let's say there's no court records. So each one walks out of court and each one claims that he was the winner. It's like the election, Everybody says they won the election. So, but, as we know, somebody didn't win. So who won the court case? So the Gemara says, Ne'eman Adayan, Lomar, Lazezachisi, Lazechiavti. We believe the judge, right? We believe him to establish who won and who lost. He's only an Eid Echad, and it's not Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim, because it's not Isurim. Why do we believe him? Or the Gemara says in the beginning of Bamitzia and in the end of Perushin, Neman Balamekach. Let's say somebody owns a store, right? And two people are in the store. Each one wants to buy a certain item, and he sells it to one and not the other. And then there's some dispute later on. It's sitting on the counter or whatever, and
Who had the better right?
who really purchased the. So the Gemara says, Neman balamekach lomar lozeh macharti, lozeh lo macharti. So what is that? So the answer is, it's we have rules, of credibility, of believing people, and those rules, by and large, don't differentiate between. They can't differentiate between people. Members of Klal Yisrael all have a cheskas kashrus. So you have to have kind of broad rules, and if we believe somebody,
One
believes
set of clarification.
However, just one more second. However, when somebody is in a unique position to know more than anyone else, that makes him a kind of a bailim. It gives him a kind of added, weight,
Credibility.
and as such, like the dayan, the chaya, it happened on their watch, or they're the ones who make the decision. They were involved. So it's not the typical man in the street. You're trying to figure out, is he telling the truth? Is he telling the truth? This is somebody who's in a position of responsibility and of additional knowledge in this matter. So the idea of the Rosh's idea that biyado, the Rosh is saying as follows: anybody who's in a position to change the reality, if you're in a position to be mafresh trumas u'maisros, or to remove the chalev from an animal, then we believe you about it.
That's
So
a
the way
me.
the Rosh understands it, it's not Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim.
No, because you have an expertise. You have an expertise. It'd be like eating, in someone's home because you know that they keep kosher.
No. This
Well,
is
they
really
forget
a
about the home.
migui.
We're not the home. Eating in the home is Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim. We'll get to
No,
that.
you're talking about a migui concept here,
It's not migu.
but it is.
Not migu, it's expertise.
No,
it's expertise.
No, but you're saying because I could have done something else.
Well, that's why Tosa says you don't need to be able to do it now, even. As long as at some point you could do something. If it was a migu, then you need to be able to do it now at the moment when you're being believed. Migu is a power thing. It's like if you're a liar, you have a better lie. Or if you are, you're in a stronger position because you could win this case anyway. But as Tosa says, in the case of Shchita or the others, you don't need to have that now when we believe you. You need to have had it along the way because it's expertise.
Now,
It's not,
what is the common denominator between all these cases? And are we trying to show that Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim by having all these disparate cases?
No. So what I'm trying to explain is that for Tosfos, biyado has nothing to do with Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim. That's why he's troubled by Rashi. He thinks Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim works based on the Safra law. It only works when there's no Eschazak Isura. Anything where there's Eschazak Isura, the Gemara says in Yevamos, works midin biyado, works midin bailus or expertise.
But
Now, one second. Rashi, what does Rashi think? It's strange that Rashi quotes the paradigm case of Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim is the case of Truma, is the case of Shchita, is the case of Caleb. But that's not the case. That's a case of Eschazak Isur, and it's only been in Biyado. So what the Marik and earlier the Chidush Haran say is the following. They say, Rashi didn't learn like Tosas at all. Rashi thinks that biyado is just a way of being machshir Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim. It's not separate expertise. It's not a migu and it's not bailos. If it's biyado lishanos, that neutralizes the cheskas iser. We only care about cheskas isers that are intractable. Any cheskas iser that is omedas lihishtanos is not intractable. So biyado, when Rashi said that the paradigm case of Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim are cases where there's Chazak Isurim Biyado, he was being totally accurate because Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim B'li is Chazak Isura, like Safek Chelev, Safek Shuman, equals Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim b'makom eschazak isura kishayesh biyado. Because the biyado neutralizes the eschazak isura, so you're back to square one. Now you have an echad nem and bisurim, as if there's no eschazak isura. The eschazak isura doesn't play a role according to Rashi if it's biyado. So we have two totally different understandings of biyado. Rashi's view of biyado is that it simply equates, it neutralizes eschazak isura and brings you back to the equivalent of Eidach and Bisur and B'li Eschazak Isura. And Tosas's view of biyado is that no, once you have Eschazak Isura, there's no Eidach and Bisurim at all. It only applies in cases where there's no Eschazak Isura at all. Why does it work? That's a separate category called biyado. It's the nemonus of biyado, which is a kind of either migu, but for Tosas not migu. For Tosas and for the Rush, it's a kind of bailus or expertise or special status that he has. So what emerges is a very fundamental debate between Rashi and Tosfos, almost like talking at each other. In other words, Rashi's view of Eidach and Bisurim is met with not only criticism by Tosas, but Tosas is like scratching their head, like, how could he say this? Doesn't make sense.
What was he thinking?
What?
What was he thinking?
Yeah, but the answer is he was thinking well, meaning he was saying that biyado neutralizes eschazak isura, and therefore allows eidach and bisurim to work.
I have a more fundamental question by using the woman's nida as a paradigm.
Only for Tosas, not for Rashi.
But the problem is that we know we have a rule that when, especially by husband and wife, that because they have the future possibility of doing things without Isser, they're less likely to transgress on Isser. So
Right.
the fact that she's believed in this case should not stand as a paradigm for other cases where they don't have that same situation. So how can we use that as the, so to speak, the paradigm for everything? She's believed because she has a less reason to transgress, because next week she'll be okay.
Well, it's similar to I hear the question. I think it's a good question. It's very similar to the question you were asking before, even though it's different. Before you were asking, why don't you say a kind of mitoch chomer shechmarta le b'sofa, hikalta le b'tchila. Now you're asking a parallel question, which is, why don't you say, mitoch, yena or whatever it is.
Because when you want to use something,
The Easter, yena beheter, like
you want to use it as a rule. It's got to be a case that applies to everybody. This case doesn't apply to everybody.
Right. I'll tell you something else. The Ramban doesn't say what you're saying, but the Ramban doesn't like nida as a source necessarily. Look at the Ramban, which is on page second. Yeah, page 1 on the bottom. It says Chidush Ramban Masachet Gittin base on the base, if anybody has that.
Mhm.
These are the newest Mar Makomos that were given out. Right? So the Ramban says, Pirush Rashi,
On page 1?
page 1 on the bottom, Chidush Ramban. Yeah, Eidach and Bisur. Pirush Rashi, Shekol Echad Heminasa Torah, Ala Frashas Truma V'Nikur Basar V'Gira Nasher Shchita. That's a quote of Rashi. The Yesh Mefarshim, now he's referring to Tosfos, Dichsiv Mishum Dichsiv V'Safra Lo Li'atzmo. Right? So the Ramban says, V'Kashali. He also has questions, right? What's his question? Hasam Hois Chazak Yisur, like Tosas's question. It's a Chazak Yisur because once she is Roa Dam, then until she goes to the mikvah, she is a surah lebala. So isn't it a Chazak Yisura? Shafila Pirsa Nida Imo Bemita Oshiyolda Soferis La'atzma V'Namenas Al Tvilasa. Because even if you might say, oh, well, maybe right now she's not, in a state of need. But even if we know that she was a nida, right, and then we're waiting to find out from her when she's tahora, we still believe her. V'nigmar minei. Why don't we learn therefore from if that's the makar? Why don't we learn that Eid Echad mehem afilu iskazak isura? That Eid Echad is believed even against this chazak isura. So what he says is, this is very interesting. Ela shiny hasam shemitoch nemenes la'atzma nemenes nami labayla. Avol shar eduyos minalam. So he's not asking what you're asking. What he's saying is, we believe her with respect to herself, because her status as Nida doesn't just affect her husband, it affects her in terms of taharos and other things. Once we believe her about herself, why do we believe her about herself? Because it's a maisa, she's a bait. It's like the chaya and the dayan. Well, they're special expertise, even vis-a-vis others. Here she's the bailim on herself. Of course,
yeah, but in the case of the midwife, she's an objective party.
Yeah. It's a little different. So listen to the two answers the Ramban gives. Number one is her own her credibility with respect to herself spills over and makes her a bailim even vis-a-vis her husband. But listen to the second answer is even more interesting. Inami hasami afsha shatavi edim lepsika zivasa vinidosa ulasfirasa letvilasa lefika chaminasa torah ve'in lemeda mimenu l'shar eduyos klal she'ein danin efshar mish'i efshar. The Ramban says, in the case of Nida, we have no choice but to believe her because the whole thing is very private, right? It's a matter of tznius. And of course, we have to rely on her. Who else would know what her physical status is but herself? So we have no choice. But that isn't
no such
good.
thing as a second aid in the case like this is what they're saying.
What? Yeah, exactly.
No such thing as a second aid.
But that's so interesting. And then he quotes
it's actually very obvious and good point. There can't be two Adam in a case like this.
Right. So this is very interesting. Anyway, I should mention, though, that there's another Rashi. Rashi sticks with his guns. Rashi says it's based on the biyodo neutralizing his chazak yisura case, etc. But Rashi said because the ma'asim b'chol yom we rely on people. What's interesting is that in Yevamos, looking on page 2, you'll see Rashi Yevamos, right? Masechet Yevamos Pezayin Amud Beis. Dibra Masla v'chilo makchish le'mehemen. The Rashi says, Alma eid echad mehemen be'isur v'heter. No, 1 second. No, the wrong Rashi. I take it back. Sorry. The Amar Barali de Shumanu de Mehemen in the middle of the page.
Yeah, right.
So Rashi says,
very small.
V'havadai pshitalon de samchinan aleh. It's obvious that we rely on the Eid Echad who says, that this is kosher meat or it's not kosher meat, etc. Kolzman shelo nechshad, as long as it's not a person who is suspect. The ilav hachi ein lecha adam ochel mishal chavero ve'ein lecha adam somech al bnei beisa. That's a very interesting question.
Practical comment is what he's making.
So there's a question. So if you look at
otherwise you can't eat in your house. You don't rely on this.
Rashi's basically saying what Rashi's saying is a fact, but is that a source?
Sort of circular a little bit. I mean, I have no.
Right? Is that a legal comment or a sociological one? Rashi basically says if we don't assume Eidachad Naman B'Isurim, then nobody could eat, and nobody could have a family meal. I come home. And my wife, my daughter,
By the way, here you have not only Eid Echad, you have a Nogeh B'Davar that's believed as Eid Echad.
Why is it a Nogeh B'Davar?
Because Eid Echad normally is an objective person comes in and says, I have information that I can swear to you that this happened. She's the ball in the case. I mean, it's Nogeh B'Davar.
Okay.
So you got two strikes. Only one Eid and apostle Eid. So
Rashi basically says,
whatever you want to say.
Right, no one could eat supper, or anything, in their house without having an army.
You know what? Okay, let's say we say that. So, okay, we make an exception in this case. But we want to learn out the macro case all over.
Right. So I'll tell you what I think Rashi means in a minute.
This defective case.
Right. So Tosas Chadmi Kamoi, which sounds very esoteric, but it's just they don't know who it was. So it's a perush on the side of printed on the side of the daf one of the Rishonim, but maybe from the school of Rabbi Varman Nahar, who is printed on the side of the page in Yevamos. He quotes this Rashi, and he says that's no proof. That's just a statement. And if the halacha requires more, so then you'd have to require more. He says, I don't understand Rashi at all. What do you mean Rashi says? The proof is, the source is, otherwise people wouldn't be able to eat in their home. That's a consequence. It may be true, maybe not true. It's not a proof.
And it's only by Rabbanon that we say they don't make a law to Tzibur and Yochalam.
Right, exactly. So what is this? Drachel darchei noam, or einat tzibur yicholim ein osim halacha ala tzibur elim kenat tzibur yicholim lamabo. But I don't think Rashi means it that way. I think Rashi's just saying, I think what Rashi's saying is puk chazima madavar. Klal Yisrael has always relied on Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. He's not saying, it has to, we need it. The way the Tosas Chad Mekamoy understood it was, we need it to be true, so it has to be true.
So is this?
I don't think that's what Rashi means. I think what Rashi means is, we know it to be true because, if it weren't true, we would have heard a long time ago that you need OU policemen, in everybody's house.
What is it, a Masorah?
Or a raya. It's a raya more than it is a justification. It's not a rationale, and it's not a source. It's a proof. It's what we call a lo yitachein. I mean, it's not conceivable that the OU has to, have, I'm just picking on the OU. Can be anybody. The kashrus organizations, are going to station, two kashrus police people in their house.
Well, by the way, you don't have to eat in someone's house. I mean, what's the big deal?
No, you yourself.
Your own house.
Can't eat from your wife's cooking, or wife from the
Why?
husband.
You can trust her for Nida. You can trust her for your food.
Well, that's what Rashi's isn't quoting Nida. Rashi's saying, how do we know that we trust we trust someone for their food? The answer is because otherwise people couldn't eat. You couldn't come home after a long, difficult, productive, tense, I have enough there day, for your royal, repast, you'd have to have OU policemen, saying we saw the shchita, we saw the Nikar Hagid, we saw, and so on and so forth, and
You go so far as to say the person wouldn't be able to eat from his own food?
No, because he knows his own, if he did it, he knows. So, it's a Gili Milsa to himself, and it's not only Kame Shmaya Galia, it's Kame Adam Galia. But if you're talking about anybody else, right? If my wife did it, or my son did it, or my daughter did it, or my cousin did it, or my best friend did it, right? Then how would I rely on that if I need to?
Well, maybe you could rely on the wife because Ishto Kegufo.
Well, Ishto Kegufo is great, but it's not evidence, right?
That's why I asked you if you can
So
rely
then
on
Nida
yourself.
also.
If you can rely on yourself, in other words, the question is, how can I eat for my own stuff? So
No, because I don't have a suffix.
I understand, but if you are me,
Ishto Kegufo works.
the husband and wife are Ishto Kegufo in this case.
Ishto Kegufo works in certain dinim because there's an existential bond.
I know it's an exaggerated approach.
Right. But here we're talking about, if I did the shchita, so that's factual. Anytime I'm relying on someone else, it's about belief. Even if it's, even if I have two halves, so if my one half, did something that my other half, they'll talk about Ishto Kegufo, right? Didn't know about, it's still about belief. Anyway, the point, let me make it clear. No one thinks that you need OU policemen, Baruch Hashem. Everybody agrees that Eid Echad is Ne'eman B'Yisurim. This is a theoretical discussion, but an important one. You'll see why in a moment. In addition to trying to figure out how do we know that, what's the source of that, and what's the nature of that. So, to sum up, Rashi in Yevamos was understood. Rashi in Yevamos, who says what we just read, which is the source is otherwise you couldn't eat in your own home, was understood by the Tosas Chad Mekamoy as saying We have no choice, you know. Not that this is evidence, but this is a cause. And that's why Tosas Chad B'Kamoy said, well, Yikov Adin Sahar. If the Torah and the halacha requires, you know, kashrus police, then that's what you'll have to do. Either that or prepare your own food.
From a halachic standpoint, this is only.
I don't think that's what Rashi meant. I think what Rashi meant was Puk Chazima Madavar. No one ever, you know, questioned that you're allowed to eat, you know, in your own home, even if you're not the one who prepared the food.
But is this
shows us, what that indicates, what that demonstrates, is that somehow and Tosas, I will add, Tosas in Chulin on Daf Yudam and Beis says something.
Hello.
You have to put them all
Rabbi
together.
Roth, you're not on mute.
And
Thank
in
you.
Chulin and Daf Yudam and Beis, Rashi says something a little different. There Rashi says that, you know, Erechad is nem bisurim. How come? Because the Torah says v'shochat, the Torah says v'zavachta, and then he adds, this is really important, he says, and after all, the Torah says al pi shnayim o shlosha edim, but it says that in context of dinei mamonus and onshim. It doesn't say it for everything. So there he's basically arguing, he's turning everything 180 degrees. He's saying, I don't need a proof. I don't need to provide you a source that I can.
the 2 Adam is only for dinner mominus, you want to say?
Yeah, and the fashos and, you know, an onesh. Anything else, the default is that there's credibility. That you don't need evidence.
Well, when we say
So-
Erechad Bisur, is everybody agreeing that this is only in a neutral case, not where we have reason to believe that the chazak is otherwise?
Right, we're talking about a non-chashud.
So the from a practical standpoint, anybody that says, come eat by me, okay, I'm kosher, one halachically in theory could
Unless they're
believe
chashudim, like if you know the person doesn't,
they're Mechal
is not-
Shabbos or some other thing like that.
that's when it becomes tricky, of course.
Well, you've seen him.
The person doesn't know.
You've
The
seen
person
him eat
doesn't.
in Luigi's Pizza Store or something like that.
I mean, you have to, in other words, are two things. Number one, people may think they're kosher when they're not if they don't have the knowledge of knowing what that means. They can be very sincere and very honest, but they just don't have the capacity to give you the right information. You know, some people thinks that kosher means that the chicken was blessed by the rabbi, you know,
Hebrew National.
right? That's what it says on the there was like a video that came out several years ago. One of these kashrus companies, I think it was OU or somebody else maybe, you know, they say, what does kosher mean? And they interviewed a whole bunch of people. So most of the people said kosher, you know, is an ingredient, you know, or another, that was the most popular. It means it's a particular ingredient. It's fascinating. And then other people said, no, kosher means it was blessed by a rabbi. So somebody can be sincere
Only it was that easy.
and just not be knowledgeable. And certainly, you know, kashrus can get very intricate. The second thing is you can have people who are basically sincere, and even if they know that they're not really kosher, but because they don't believe in it, they think it's some, you know, superstition or whatever. So they'll say, yeah, we're kosher, because from their point of view, they might be telling you an untruth, but they don't think that they're damaging you because they don't, you know, it's not
Give it any credence.
for them. So you have to be, I mean, I'm just trying to make, I'm not giving a practical seminar right now, and we can do that sometime if you want. But I'm just trying to point out that when we talk about Echanem on Bisurim, the assumption is A, that the people involved are knowledgeable, and B, that they're committed, and that they're not chashudim. Otherwise, you know, the whole thing doesn't, you know, doesn't really work. So give me 1 second. I'm trying to find the language of the Rashi I'm just looking. Oh, here it is. 1 second. So Rashi, I think I have it here. Second. Rashi in Chulin. No, I don't see it. 1 second. Let me try one more thing. Rashi in Chulin basically says, as I just indicated, that it's really the opposite, meaning the default is that we believe people, right? It's only, I'm not finding it. Okay. The default is that we believe people, and it's only in Ishus and Mammon and Onshim that the Torah says al pi shnayim. Okay, but according to Tosas, all this is wrong. Tosas thinks that the makar is v'safra. You need a makar, and you have a makar. So this argument between Rashi and Tosas, A, do you need a proper makar, or can we just assume that people are telling the truth when it comes to this matter? B, Rashi in the end of the day is saying, even if you have this chazik isura, Eid Echad is neman if it's biyado, because biyado is still under the rubric of Eid Echad neman bisurim. It neutralizes this chazik isura. Tosas, as we noted, thinks that biyado is an independent category, and anytime Eid Echad runs up against this chazik isura, it doesn't work. So it emerges from both of those two points. There's a unified theory argument here, and that is Rashi seems to be saying that Eid Echad neman bisurim is something that is very reliable. Meaning, when an Eid Echad tells you that this is the status of the object, it's shuma, not chelev, it's kosher meat, not non-kosher meat, right? You don't have to think, okay, I'll rely on it. I'm not really 100% sure, but the Torah says I can rely on it. That's not the way Rashi looks at it. The way Rashi looks at it is, until we have reason to suspect, we believe what we're told by this individual, he has credibility, and we believe it. It's kosher meat. But for Tosfos, the believability, the credibility of the Eid Echad is already limited. It will never apply in this Kazik Isura, and even Biyado won't help you for that. It'll help you, but in its own way, not as Eid Echad Naman Bisurim. Moreover, if you didn't have a makar for Eid Echad Naman Bisurim, according to Tosfos, we wouldn't rely on it. Meaning, Rashi seems to be have a greater sense of comfort with relying on Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim, thinking that there's no problem, and Tosas is seeing it more as, it puts us over the top. You can rely on it, but so that's why it's not so surprising.
Neither Rashi or Tosas is buying into this idea that the need for 2A only applies to Mama Bina and Farshis.
No, Rashi in Chulin says that. I mean, that fits with Rashi, just that he doesn't make that comment here. And Rashi speaks about this in 3 different places.
But if Rashi holds that, he doesn't have to get into anything else. It's home free right there.
Yeah, but we're only home free but that feeds into what I'm saying now too, which is, the exception is that you don't believe, they have a higher threshold, and that's in Onesh, Mammon, Erva, etc. Every other time, you should believe somebody because they have a kaskas kashrus, right? So all I'm trying to show is that for Rashi, relying on Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim is a safe bet, and for Tosfos, it's a legal right, but it's not so much a safe bet. So now let me say something else. Tosfos makes the following really interesting distinction. If you look at Tosfos on based on the base here, and Tosfos has this in Kedushin too, but if you look back on page 1 or in the Gemara, you'll see, one second. So look at Midi Dehava Akol Eduyos Shabbatorah, the first Tosfos that's on the page. Tosfos says Bidalid Garcinon. There's a question, Dalids and Rashas look very similar, especially in script, right? So is it Midi Dehava Kol Eduyos Shabbatorah or Kol Midi Dehava Kol Arayos Shabbatorah? Okay. Anyway, the right girsa according to Rashi is Bidalid. Kagon Edus Dine Mominus, Dine Nefashos, the Istigaris Arayos, Beresh, Velo Nehira. Im Kain, if it was Arayos that we were emphasizing, My Mishani Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim, how could you say the words Eid Echad Naman B'Yisurim if you think it's Erva? Malo Lahaskir Isurim, Erva Nami Isuhu. You should have, just zeroed in on that problem. But then Tosas adds something amazing. Listen to this. Umir yesh lomar, lahachi kamar. Eid echad neman b'isurim lahatir. Tosas says maybe it's possible to say that we believe in Eid echad in matters of ritual status, things like kashrus and so on. We only believe in lahatir, right? To give license, to be lenient. But boy, Trey, I would say ain't davar shebe'erva, and that we thought we're right now in the Havam, and we thought that's the same as Isurim. What happened to ain't davar shebe'erva? Hanimili lesar. That's when you're trying to impose a chumrah, a stringency. The chad lav kol kamine. Wow. So Rashi here, there's really a double Rashi. Rashi here is basically suggesting the possibility that Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim would apply only lahatir and not lesar. We believe you to allow, to permit. But if you were to, if the Eid Echad were to say it's prohibited, we wouldn't believe. Lav kol kamine, you need two people to create an Isur. So two things are amazing about this.
The other way
I should
around.
add that Tosas in Kiddushin and Daf Samachem Amud Aleph or Samachem Beis, says this is true lahalacha, not just in the Havamin of our Gemara. He says Eid Echad is neman be'isurim lahatir, but not necessarily lasar. The Ramban, I'll try to get to it in a minute, in our Masechta, right here in Gittin, seems to say, well, I mean, the Ramban, the Rajva, most of the Chachmei Sfarad say it doesn't matter. If Eid Echad is neman, he's neman bein lahatir bein liyiser, and if he's not neman, he's not neman bein lahatir bein liyiser. However, Agav, the Ramban indicates that if you were going to make a distinction, the distinction anyways would be in the opposite direction.
That's exactly what I was saying.
Meaning Eid Echad would be neman lesor, he wouldn't be neman lahatir. Why? Because in terms of risk aversion, right? It's always easy to be machmir. It's more difficult to be mekel, right? If you're machmir means you want to eat this juicy steak, you're not sure if it's kosher or not, so you're not gonna eat it. It's too much of a risk. But lesor, that's lesor.
Wouldn't it depend on the state of chazaka?
What?
In other words, it should really just depend on the state of chazaka.
No, let's assume there's no chazaka for the moment, right? So what Tosas seems to be saying, but
no chazaka would accrue to the benefit of the person. So I could see that. In other words,
let's say you have safek chelev, safek shuman. You have a piece of meat. Let's say it's 50-50 chance that it came from the kosher butcher shop or from the non-kosher.
One person gives a hitus that it's kosher.
So you could have two scenarios. The Eid Echad comes and says it's kosher, right? Or the Eid Echad comes in and says it's from the treifa butcher shop. So what Tosas seems to be saying is it's easier to accept Eid Echad neman b'isurim lahatir and harder le'asor. And the Ramban seems to be suggesting that if there was going to be, he doesn't like this distinction, the Ramban, but if there was going to be this distinction, he would have made it in the opposite direction. He would have said Eid Echad lesor, but not necessarily lahatir. Can we understand both of those views? Sure. And by the way, we've been encountering this in a different way all year round. Remember, we talked about the hekesh of kiddushin and gerushin, makesh havaya liyitzia, right? V'yatzav haisa, meaning there's a lot of dinim that are derived from gittin to kiddushin, from kiddushin to gittin. Every once in a while, one of the Rishonim rebels and says, what are you talking about? They're opposite directions. One is lahatir and one is lasar. But what we found all year round is that some of them rebel in one direction and some of them rebel in the other direction. Meaning, this is a whole discussion we had about Ksav Yado, if you remember. The Rajba, the Ritva, and so on. I mean, some of them say, listen, it's always harder to, to
Be matir than
to
be-
prove lahatir in terms of risk aversion. It's always easier to say, you know what, I'm misafek, I'm not going to do it. You need more.
Well, we say
evidence.
kochta tera adif. Is that in line with that?
So kochta terodif is a great point, but in itzia nosenes, meaning if you understand what kochta ter, I'm going to explain kochta terodif because you asked about it. I remember growing up, it was like always very popular. People say, you shouldn't be so machmir, kochta terodif. But what kochta terodif really means is the opposite. Meaning means like this. If somebody was
Have a basis for it. then
one
it's-
second. If somebody was matir, this is Rashi in Masachet Beitza, right in the beginning, where the Gemara says kochta tera adif. So Rashi explains it means the following: if somebody was matir, then obviously he has a stronger conviction, because if he didn't have a strong basis, he wouldn't have been matir. He would have been machmir. So the words kochta tera adif means the power of leniency is greater. And some people misconstrue it to mean it's better to be lenient than it is to be stringent. But that's not how Rashi understood the concept. Rashi understood it exactly the opposite, which is if you only have the luxury of being lenient if you have a strong enough evidence. You can be lenient only with evidence. You can be stringent even if you don't have evidence. And therefore, anybody who is lenient, we assume that he's done more research or that there's a stronger basis for his leniency. In other words, the effect of koch tera adif is that we're assuming that the stronger theoretical position is that of the matir because he needs a stronger position to come to his conclusion.
Correct. And it's also someone who has the credibility, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, if they don't have credibility, then the whole thing's a joke
Right.
anyway.
It's a great example though, because it's really one of the most misconstrued statements around, and as I say, in exactly the opposite, way of its meaning.
Well,
It means if you're going to be matir, then obviously in reconstructing, if I know a great man or a serious authority was matir, you can be sure that there was a strong.
They did their homework.
They did their homework.
It never
If
says.
they're oser, we're not sure that they did their homework enough.
It never says koech de matir, which would imply that there's nobility,
Right.
which is the way it's
That there's
misunderstood.
That's better to be a lenient person.
Right,
than
but it says koech de hetero, which
hetera.
the
Great.
dalit is that it's the hetera itself is stronger. It's based on
indicative
stronger evidence.
It's indicative of exactly of a stronger foundation.
It's not
So
koech
this
de
is really
matir.
an interesting thing that Tosa says Eid Echad can't be oser, but that's a different question. That might be like a default question. Like there's a philosophical question here too, which is like, is everything oser until it's mutter, or is everything mutter until it's oser in the world? Or maybe there's no default like that. But there's
I mean, I don't know if this is just conventional understanding, but the koech de hetera seems to be for cases that operate in a vacuum, where we don't have all these other contributing factors of nemanis and chazaka, right? I mean, that's right. They're sort of,
it's not a factor in making decisions. It's a reconstruction of how likely there's a strong foundation.
Right. If you have it's sort of a de novo suffix, an unencumbered suffix.
Right.
To go in the direction of a Torah requires a stronger argument.
Yeah, exactly. So, and again, it's just it's fascinating because it's taken always, usually by people who don't have sufficient, it could be well-meaning people, but who aren't, sufficiently versed or immersed, in the system. Anyways, so what emerges is very interesting, namely. But take a step back and think about it for a moment. So Tosas is suggesting here as a havamina, meaning as a way of explaining the Gemara, but doesn't make the cutting, the final cut in terms of halacha. But Tosfos and Kedushin has it even as the final cut halacha. And by the way, in Yoredeya, Siman Kuf Kav Zayin, that's the Siman in Shulchan Aruch that speaks about Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim the most. Interesting. The context is Yain Nesach or Stam Yainam, meaning non-Jewish wine. So it's there that the Shulchan Aruch, for some reason, has the most extensive discussion of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. So this idea of maybe distinguishing between Lehetera and Leisura and both views appears in the poskim. But when you think about it and take a step back and think about it, Tosfos proposes it, according to my view of Tosfos and the unified theory, it makes total sense, because Tosfos is basically saying, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is not a sure thing. And, it doesn't override Ischazak Isura. And without a makar, we never would have said it. We won't say it misvara. It's based on the Safra law. And now Tosfos is saying a third thing, and that is that, we'll say Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, but maybe in one direction, not the other. Again, for Tosfos, it's Lehetera, not Leisura. The Ramban was saying if you're going to make the distinction, make it in the opposite direction. Fine, either way. But the point is, anybody who's distinguishing, if let me say this, if Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, if the credibility is totally reliable, 100% reliable, or reliable enough that there's no second guessing, you're not going to distinguish between Lehetera and Leisura. Why should you? It's facts are facts, or a strong foundation should be a strong foundation in either direction. The only reason that you would distinguish between Lehetera and Leisura in either in whichever favor would be because there's some discomfort about the objective suasiveness, right, or credibility of Eid Echad B'Yisurim. So then we're saying, you know what, we're going to go in one direction with it, but not the other. If you ask me, Rashi and the Ramban and the Rajba, who are much more comfortable with Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim to begin with, right? They would, in a wholesale manner, reject the notion that that there would be any kind of difference between Lehetera and Leisura in whatever direction, because it's just like two witnesses, for example. No one ever is going to tell you that Shnayim Eidim, would only work, to be lenient or only work to be stringent. No, because we believe two witnesses are factual. Until we know otherwise, we trust them completely. We even say Trei Kameya. Once you have two, 100 can't beat two. 100 equals two. Because once you have two, you have a sufficient basis of truth. So do we say the same thing on the Isurim level and a much lower threshold for Eid Echad? Now, it's since Eid Echad doesn't work in Dinei Mamonos and in Onshim and in Erva, so the idea that even when it does work, there's still some suffix and therefore some discomfort with it, and therefore maybe we should cut our losses and only say it in one direction or another, makes a lot of sense. But I think that Rashi and the Ramban would have said that even though it's not Shnayim Eidim, for the world, for the threshold that is required in Isurim, we're comfortable with it. We think it's the truth. If the stakes are lower, the standards are different, but it's reliable. And if it's reliable, then it doesn't make sense to seek a distinction between leniency and stringency.
The circumstances of Eid Echad are many common day things. So the opposing view to the Tosfos is that actually there's no obvious pasuk. So therefore, it's more likely to be a background. There's not an aid. An aid is one aid is not the same type of aidus as two aidim. It's sort of like serious aidus begins with two, and that's why Trei Kameya. An Eid Echad is not really. I don't know. I'm not saying it's not an aid.
No, that's exactly what we're discussing.
Yeah,
but just to highlight what you're saying, let me just add the words. When we talk about two, we speak about eidos.
Right.
When we talk about one in Isurim, we talk about nemanos.
Right.
We don't talk about evidence or witnesses. We talk about nemanos, credibility. Exactly what you're saying. So I think Tosas takes it to an extreme by saying, and we're not, you can rely on it, but we're not so confident about it. And therefore we might say not against this Chazak Isura and not without a Makar and not necessarily in both.
But none of these use
Rashi's
the
more confident, but
Right.
even for Rashi, it's not Eidos. Eidos is, evidence. And Eidachad Bisurim is Nemanus, is credibility, but it's not evidence.
does about, but with the straight, how is it though that none of them use the word nemonis? Those
Yeah.
that Rashi and
No. I mean, the Gemara says Eidachad Neman.
Yes. Okay. All right. So
They're
that's
just, they're just jumping on that bandwagon. But it's very, the linguistic point. Here we're always talking about Eidos, and there we're talking about Nemanus. I think is very.
I mean, there's no. I mean, Ashnaya made him Yakum Dover. It's a difference of,
Yeah.
of
It
a
doesn't
key.
say Yamin or
Yeah.
Neman.
Right. That's good.
So I think it's really, really important. Now, what I'm going to try to show, my time is up for today, but the Tashbitz, who we also have in these Marmakomos, has like a sensational piece in Chelek Aleph Simin Ayin Zayin, where he actually compares Eid Echad in Shavua, which we talked about last year, and Eid Echad in Isurim, and what we call Eidos Miyuchedes, thinks they're practically all interchangeable when they work. So this whole point that I'm making now about the difference between Nemanus and Eidos is not completely true according to Tashbitz, but in my opinion, he's an outlier, who has a fascinating presentation. But I don't think, at least in that regard, and with regard to these issues, I don't think his view is the mainstream, view. So we'll talk about that next week. And then I want to talk about some other issues, like, for example, an issue that we've discussed in the past, but now to put it in context, and that is, let's say the information, we'll call it, of Eid Echad Neman Bisurim gets into the court system. Can it be used now, in cases that affect like a higher threshold, like Mamon or Erva or Onshim, etc. So this is the famous Rambam. If you want to see, maybe we'll just look at this Rambam and we'll stop with this. But if you look at the Rambam on page the Marmakomos that I gave, it's on page 3. Yeah, the bottom of page 3. Have your Rambam Hilchos Sanhedrin Perek Tazayin Halacha Vav. This is a very fascinating Rambam. There are other Rambams like it, but it's something to think about. We'll leave it as food for thought till next week. Einot Tzarech Shnei Edim Lamalkus, and then I want to make just stay on for a minute because I want to make a scheduling comment. Einot Tzarech Shnei Edim Lamalkus Ela B'Shas Ma'isa. We only need 2 witnesses if in a case that has to do with corporal punishment at the time or when we're talking about the action itself. Meaning, let's say there's an accusation that somebody ate chaylev and you want to give him, as a result, lashes, malchus. So if you want to prove that he ate chaylev, you'd have to bring 2 witnesses, not 1, because the Kabbalah Sedus refers to the onesh part of the case. However, aval, listen to this is the chiddush of the Rambam. Ha'isur atzmo be'ed echad yuchzak, to establish the status of the food, that can be done by an eid echad, and then in the future that can have impact on ownership. Ketzad, for example, Omer eid echad chelev klayo suzeh, kilaya kerenheim peroselu, gusho zona ishazu. Right? Let's say an eid echad comes to court and he identifies a piece of meat, a piece of Tavua, an individual, and he, based on Eid Echad Neman Bisurim, he establishes their status in a neutral way. There's no din Torah yet about it. Then afterwards, v'achal obo'al be'edim achar shehisrabo. Let's say after the Eid Echad comes to court and says this piece of meat is treif, so then somebody comes to court knowing this, picks it up and eats it. Had they been reversed, had the person, done the eating, and then the accusation was that he knew it was chaylev, you'd have to prove it with two witnesses. Here, the chaylev has been established by one witness, and now the guy picks it up and eats it. Says the Rambam, he's going to get malchus for that. Harezaloka, afal pisha ikar ha'isur beid achad. B'medvar mamurim shlo hikrish ha'id shekava ha'isur. Aval amamar eno chaylev eno grusha v'achal ba'al. Of course, if he disputes it when the Eid Echad comes to court and says this is chaylev, and this guy says no, it's not. It didn't come from McDonald's. It came from they used to have near YU. They used to have a store called McDavid's. I don't think it exists anymore. Which came first, McDonald's or McDavid's? I'm not sure. But
I'm sure McDonald's.
What?
I'm sure McDonald's came before McDavid's.
I think that's a blasphemous thing to say. Anyways, the idea of the Rambam is a fascinating idea, because you have, in other words, you have a lower threshold for Isser than for Mammon or Malchus, right? But as long as it gets into the court system as a fact, without any kind of dire consequences that would have required a higher threshold, once it's part of the system, we believe it. But if Eid Echad Nem Bisurim always has a bit of a question mark, that would not be true. So this is a fascinating question to think about, and we'll discuss this and some other questions in Yom Hashem next week. I think next week might be our last shir, because the 20th, unless you want to try to move the 20th to the 21st. Hold on one second. Is Jacob still there?
Yes. You want to switch a Tuesday to a Wednesday, you're saying?
We could do that for the final shir. The last shir would be either, I have something on the 20th, so I'm not going to.
Okay, so why don't we meet? Next week is regular, right?
Next week is regular. That's
So why don't we talk next week with the group and see who's
available.
For Wednesday night,
for the 21st. Yeah. So either our last shir will be next week, or the 21st, if we can arrange that.
Okay. And do we know what Masechta we're learning next year?
Yes, Yevamos.
Okay, amazing. For which parak?
I think from the beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Okay. Have a great week, everybody, and to be continued.
Okay.
Thank you very
you.
much. Thank you.
And the Neshama should have an aliyah. As I say, your husband was really a very special person. I always think of
The
him.
Yekes say Ad Biat HaGoel.
Ad Biat Goel.
So 1 second. Magnus's yard site is tonight or was today?
No, last night. We had a learning last night. No, it was yesterday. So we had a learning in the middle of the day. So the people in Israel was all in Zoom. So my daughter in Israel, his nieces and nephews in Israel all participated.
Excellent.
Beautiful.
So it was 7 in the evening in Israel, it was 12 o'clock here.
Beautiful. Tonight's Yisrael Halpert's yard site also.
Wow.
But second yard site.
Oh,
Okay.
Very sad. Yeah.
Okay.
We missed them all.
Thank you.
Both of them.
Thank
Good
you
to
very
know.
much.
Have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.